Have you ever stopped to wonder why a simple piece of paper can buy you a home, a meal, or a life's dream? We carry it every day, yet few ever ask why it holds power at all. Somewhere along the line, we all agreed that it means something. But what gives it that meaning? Ink and numbers, or something far more fragile? In a quiet temple long ago, a merchant arrived with heavy bags of silver. He was tired from the road, worn from travel, but the silver had made it safely. He handed it over to the temple's keepers, not as an offering but for safekeeping. In return, they gave him a slip of paper, a simple note. It said how much he had deposited and who it belonged to. That paper wasn't beautiful. It didn't shine like silver or ring in the hand, but it carried something that no metal ever could: trust. The merchant believed the temple would honor its word. Others believed it too, and so the note began to move, from one hand to another, from one town to the next, a weightless promise backed by faith alone. This is how it began, not with kings or bankers, but with belief. For most of human history, money was something you could touch. Gold, silver, copper, things that glittered and clanked, reassuringly real. But paper changed everything. It asked us to believe in something unseen, to exchange value not in metal but in trust, and over centuries we did. Paper money didn't conquer the world overnight. It drifted across empires and oceans, through temples and markets, carried by whispers of confidence. Each note was a story, a record of faith, a silent agreement that what we believe together can become real. If you stay for this journey, you'll see how that invisible faith reshaped civilization, how belief replaced metal, how promises became currency, and how trust itself became the foundation of every modern economy. This isn't just a story about money. It's a story about us, about what we choose to value, what we choose to believe, and how that belief built the world we live in today. So if you haven't yet, take a moment to subscribe and join this exploration, not of wealth, but of meaning, because by the end of this story, you might see that the most powerful thing humanity ever created wasn't gold or paper, it was trust. And it all began here. Chapter 1: Temples of Trust. Before banks, before coins jingled in pockets or paper folded into wallets, there were temples. Not just places of worship, but places of record, places of safety. In the still air of ancient sanctuaries, beneath statues of gods and walls carved with prayers, a quieter ritual was taking place. Merchants, travelers, and farmers would walk through sacred halls carrying what little they owned in silver, grain, or bronze. They weren't there to offer it to the gods. They were there to store it. Not because they were wealthy, but because they were afraid. In early Mesopotamia, around 3000 BCE, temples were the centers of life. They were strong, well-guarded, and seen as neutral ground. People trusted the priests, not just with their souls, but with their savings. Clay tablets served as receipts marked with cuneiform signs and seals. If you gave the temple your grain, they gave you a tablet. That tablet became proof. And sometimes it became something more, a promise you could pass on. If someone else trusted the temple too, they might accept the tablet in trade, knowing they could redeem it themselves. In this way, a stored good became a transferable claim. That's not so different from money. These early tablets weren't paper, but they were paper-like in spirit. They replaced the physical item with a record, a story, something that said, "This exists somewhere, and I have a right to it." Even when the actual silver or grain sat untouched behind temple walls, the idea of ownership moved out into the world. This shift, from object to symbol, was quiet but revolutionary. It let value float. It let trust travel. Ancient Egypt followed a similar path. Temples and royal granaries functioned as early financial hubs. Surplus grain was stored in giant silos and logged by scribes. Instead of hauling sacks of wheat to the market, farmers could trade the receipts. These papyrus documents, written in clear script, made the invisible visible. The grain didn't need to move. The promise did. And over time, that promise became just as useful as the wheat itself. In a hot, dry land where famine could strike without warning, the ability to store and claim food was everything. What mattered most wasn't how much grain you had, but how much people believed you had. Trust was never just spiritual, it was practical. The same temples that held statues of gods also held ledgers. Sacredness gave these places power, not just divine but social. If a temple cheated someone, it risked its place in the community. If a priest forged a record, he risked more than jail. He risked heaven. This made temples reliable. In a world without banks or central governments, trust had to root itself somewhere strong. Temples became that anchor. In ancient India, Buddhist monasteries and temple complexes along trade routes offered similar services. Pilgrims, traders, and local villagers entrusted their coins or valuables to the monks, often in exchange for written acknowledgments. These receipts, bearing seals or signatures, could sometimes be passed along, especially among those who knew and respected the temple's name. The idea spread quietly, not as policy, but as practice. People used what worked. The same was true in early China. Long before paper money took hold, Chinese temples played a role in the storage and certification of wealth. In times of unrest or war, when bandits roamed the countryside, a temple's thick walls and spiritual authority made it one of the safest places to hide treasure. A local official or merchant might leave a hoard of coins or silk there, receiving in return a certificate of deposit. These certificates, marked by recognizable stamps or inscriptions, sometimes changed hands, not often, not yet in mass circulation, but the idea had taken root. Paper, or something like it, could carry value without carrying weight. Each of these ancient systems shared something in common. They replaced presence with proof. The thing itself didn't have to change hands. Only the promise had to. That was a quiet revolution. It meant that wealth could move without wagons or guards. It meant that trade could speed up and risk could slow down. It meant that value could be light enough to carry in a robe or a satchel, not in chests or carts. But none of this worked without trust. Every note, every tablet, every slip of papyrus relied on someone believing the thing behind it was real and retrievable. If the temple burned, if the priest fled, if the storehouse was robbed or empty, then the promise vanished too. There was no insurance, no central bank, no regulator. The only guarantee was reputation, and reputation was everything. Still, these early systems endured, not everywhere and not always smoothly, but the idea, the invisible tether between a promise and a place, kept showing up again and again across continents and cultures. The technology didn't matter as much as the psychology. People were willing to believe in something they couldn't see if they trusted the source. That simple shift changed everything. The rise of writing helped. A promise written down could be clearer than one spoken. It could travel farther. it could be shown to others, and most importantly, it could outlive the person who made it. Writing turned a moment of trust into something durable, something that lasted beyond breath. That durability made value more portable, more flexible, more abstract. And once value became abstract, it could scale. This chapter in history is quiet because it has no grand battles or famous kings, but it may be one of the most important in the story of money. In the shadows of temples, under the watch of gods and scribes, humanity learned something profound. That value doesn't always have to be heavy. It can be stored, promised, passed on. It can be written into being. And that lesson would echo forward, shaping every future currency, every financial system, every quiet exchange between two people who say, "Here, take this. You can trust me." As metal would one day give way to paper, and paper to code, it all began here. With clay, with grain, with a slip of papyrus handed across a sacred room. The object didn't matter, the trust did. And in the centuries to come, that trust would be tested, stretched, broken, and rebuilt, again and again, as the world searched for new ways to carry value without carrying weight. Chapter 2: The Tang Dynasty's Paper Promise. In the bustling city of Chengdu during the height of China's Tang dynasty, something strange was happening. Merchants were walking into the market with nothing in their hands, no heavy bags of copper coins, no sacks of goods, and yet they were buying. They were trading pieces of paper, not for grain or silk, but for other paper. Paper that promised value, paper backed not by gold but by trust. This was the beginning of the world's first true paper money. By the 7th century, China was alive with trade. Its economy was growing fast. The Silk Road stretched across mountains and deserts, connecting China to the Middle East and beyond. Inside the empire, canals and roads tied provinces together. Markets buzzed with activity. But with that growth came a problem. Money was too heavy. At the time, China used copper coins. Round, with a square hole in the center, they were strung together in long ropes, sometimes hundreds at a time. If a merchant needed to make a large payment, he might need a donkey to carry his coins, or two. Traveling with that much weight wasn't just slow, it was dangerous. So the merchants in Sichuan tried something new. Instead of dragging coins through the streets, they left them with trusted shops, private deposit houses. In return, they received handwritten certificates called jiaozi. These notes could be exchanged later for the same amount of coin. The idea was simple, but its impact was enormous. Jiaozi weren't just receipts. They were light, portable, and, more importantly, exchangeable. If two merchants trusted the same shop, they could pass the note between them like cash. What began as a tool for convenience became a medium of trade. These paper promises flowed through markets into towns across cities. People began to accept them, not because they were law, but because they worked. The government took notice. At first it watched, then it stepped in. During the Song dynasty, which followed the Tang, the state took over the printing and regulation of paper money. In 1023, the government issued the first official state-backed paper currency. These weren't handwritten notes from private shops. They were printed with carved wooden blocks, stamped with official seals, and backed by the power of the emperor. They had expiration dates, limits on use, and laws against counterfeiting. This was the moment paper money became real. Not just in practice, but in policy. The state declared, "This note is as good as coin," and the people, already used to the idea, believed it. China had created something revolutionary, a government-issued currency made not of metal, but of meaning, the world's first. But even then, this system rested on a fragile balance. Trust had simply moved from merchants to officials, from shopkeepers to emperors. If people believed the state would honor its promises, the notes held value. If they doubted, the paper turned to dust. The Song dynasty learned this the hard way. To fund wars and cover deficits, the government began printing more paper money than it had coined to back. At first, no one noticed. Trade continued. Markets hummed. But slowly, confidence eroded. Prices rose. Inflation crept in. What once felt like a brilliant solution now carried a quiet weight. Too much paper, not enough trust. Still, the idea didn't vanish. It had taken root. Paper money spread across the empire, adapted by later dynasties, each trying to balance the power of printing with the need for belief. Some succeeded, others didn't, but the concept had broken through. Money didn't have to be metal, it didn't have to shine, it only had to be trusted. What made China's innovation so remarkable wasn't just its timing, it was the scale. By the 11th century, entire regions of the empire were running on paper. Government printers churned out notes in vast quantities. The designs grew more complex. Intricate patterns, multiple seals, warnings against forgery. One note warned, counterfeiters will be decapitated. Trust, after all, still needed to be enforced. Foreign visitors were stunned. When Muslim traders and diplomats traveled to China, they marveled at this strange system. Later, when Marco Polo arrived in the 13th century, he was astonished. He couldn't believe that people were trading slips of bark paper for gold and silk, and that it worked. In the West, the idea of money detached from metal still felt impossible, but in China, it had already become a part of daily life. And yet, it was never just about the paper. It was about what the paper pointed to. Each note was a symbol, not a substance, a reflection of a promise, not the thing itself. And as long as people believed in the system behind it, the officials, the state, the order, that paper could move mountains. The paper promise of the Tang and Song dynasties revealed a deep truth about human economics. That value is not in the object, but in the agreement, not in the weight, but in the meaning. That realization didn't just change markets, it changed minds. And it wasn't just the economy that changed, it was the empire itself. Paper money helped unify vast regions, simplify trade, and tie distant provinces to the center. A note printed in one city could be used in another. This was more than convenience, it was cohesion. In a land of mountains and rivers, with dozens of dialects and cultures, a shared currency became a quiet force of unity. But paper also made it easier to overspend, easier to borrow against the future, and when belief faltered, when wars broke out or governments collapsed, the paper could fall with them. Trust, once lost, was hard to print again. Still, something powerful had been set in motion. Long before Europe would dare such a leap, China had shown the world what was possible, that the future of money would not be found in the mine, but in the mind. The Jiaozi of Chengdu, the official notes of the Song, and the travelers stunned by bark paper currency. These are not just footnotes in history. They are quiet markers of a turning point, when money stopped being only what you could carry and started becoming what you could believe. And in the centuries ahead, others would take notice, not just of the paper itself, but of the invisible thread that held it all together. The thread of trust. Chapter 3: Genghis Khan and the Empire of Paper. Across the wide plains of Central Asia, where the horizon seems endless and the sky swallows the earth, riders once carried a different kind of power. They rode not just with bows and sabers, but with orders sealed by the great Khan. Under Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the edges of Europe. It was the largest land empire the world had ever seen, and at its heart, for the first time on such a scale, lay paper money. When Kublai Khan rose to power in the 13th century, he inherited not just a vast empire, but a vast problem. His lands were stitched together by conquest, but conquest alone could not bind them. Languages, religions, and economies differed wildly. Trade moved across deserts, mountains, and seas. Metal coins, heavy, slow, and scarce, could not keep up. The empire needed a lighter thread to weave its markets together. It found that thread in paper. China had already pioneered state-backed paper currency under the Song dynasty. Kublai Khan took that idea and turned it into an instrument of imperial control. In 1260, he declared the use of paper money mandatory. The notes were printed from the inner bark of mulberry trees, stamped with official seals, and infused with imperial authority. Anyone refusing to accept them risked severe punishment. Where earlier dynasties had coaxed people into trust, Kublai commanded it. Marco Polo, who traveled through the Mongol Empire, described this system with astonishment. He wrote of the Khan's alchemic power to make bark paper into money as fine as silk, and of how no one dared disobey. What Polo witnessed was not simply commerce. It was a deliberate act of empire building. By replacing local currencies with a single paper standard, Kublai was doing more than solving logistical problems. He was centralizing trust. But trust imposed by decree is not the same as trust freely given. The Mongol paper currency worked because it was backed by more than bark. It was backed by fear, force, and the promise of the Khan's treasury. Officials ensured that every merchant, from Persian traders to Chinese shopkeepers, accepted the notes. Taxes were collected in paper. Payments to soldiers and bureaucrats were issued in paper. Even foreign merchants were obliged to trade with it. The empire's roads and postal relays, built to carry messages, now also carried money. This made paper not just convenient, but unavoidable. At first, the system worked. It made trade faster across the empire's enormous distances. It simplified tax collection. It gave the state flexibility, allowing it to fund armies and public works without the slow drag of metal coins. For a time, the Mongol Empire ran on paper as smoothly as it once ran on horses. But paper alone could not tame an empire as sprawling and unstable as this one. Wars drained the treasury. Printing more notes became the easiest answer to shortages. Inflation crept in. Confidence wavered. The very thing that had helped hold the empire together began to fray. By the time later Mongol rulers tried to maintain the system, the paper currency had lost much of its value. Trust, once stretched too far, had snapped. Even so, the Mongol experiment left a lasting mark. It showed the world that paper money could function not just within a single kingdom, but across a vast, multi-ethnic empire. it also revealed the double edge of this power. Paper could unify, but it could also destabilize. Its strength lay not in the material, but in the discipline of the issuer. Without restraint, even the most powerful emperor could not command belief. Yet the story of Kublai Khan's paper money is not only about economics, it is about imagination. To accept a piece of bark paper as valuable across thousands of miles required a leap of faith and an understanding of imperial reach. When a Persian merchant in Samarkand or a Russian trader in Novgorod took Mongol notes, he was acknowledging not just the value of the paper, but the authority of the Khan. Money, in this case, became an extension of power. The empire was not only mapped by roads and garrisons, but by a shared currency that crossed its borders. The Mongols also spread the concept of paper money far beyond China. As their empire linked east and west, the idea of state-issued notes traveled with them. Muslim scholars, Venetian traders, and European envoys all carried back stories of this strange system. In Europe, the idea of paper money still seemed unthinkable, but after Polo's descriptions, it no longer seemed impossible. A seed had been planted. A vision of money detached from metal, backed by a sovereign's promise rather than a sovereign's vault. Kublai Khan's paper currency was not perfect. It suffered inflation, counterfeiting, and eventual collapse, but its legacy was larger than its flaws. It demonstrated that money is not just a tool for exchange, but a tool for governance. It revealed that trust can be compelled for a time, but only earned for the long run, and it proved that the reach of paper is as wide as the reach of power. In the quiet of a market stall in the Mongol Empire, a merchant handing over a slip of paper was participating in something bigger than a transaction. He was taking part in an experiment in human faith, one that would echo across continents and centuries. Even as the empire faded, the idea endured. Paper money had leapt from China's provinces to the world stage. Its next journeys would no longer be imposed by emperors alone, but by networks of traders, bankers, and states learning to balance belief and supply. The plains where Mongol horses once thundered are now silent. The empire has long since dissolved, but the story of its paper money still matters. It was a moment when value left the mine and the mint to ride on the wind, as light as bark, as strong as empire. And from that moment forward, paper would never again be just paper. It would be a stage on which power, trust, and imagination played out, shaping the future of money in ways the Khan himself could not have foreseen. Chapter 4: The Islamic Golden Age and Bills of Exchange. In the dry heat of Basra, as sails flapped softly on the Persian Gulf and traders prepared for long journeys east, a man tucked a folded piece of parchment into his robe. He wasn't carrying coin. He wasn't carrying gold. What he carried was lighter, quieter, and in many ways more powerful. It was called a sack. By the 8th century, as the Islamic world entered its golden age, the rhythm of trade was everywhere. From the ports of North Africa to the markets of India, goods flowed in steady, silent lines. Spices, silks, glass, books, steel. But behind every shipment was something less visible: trust. Trade over such long distances couldn't rely on heavy sacks of coins. It needed something that could move as easily as a whisper, something made of words. The sack was one answer, a written promise, a bill of exchange. It wasn't money itself, but a promise of money. One merchant could deposit gold with a banker in Baghdad, receive a sack in return, and pass that document to another trader in Cairo. That trader could redeem it, confident the bank would honor it. In this way, money began to travel without traveling at all. This wasn't just innovation, it was survival. The Islamic Empire stretched across 3 continents. Its cities were rich but scattered. No one wanted to carry gold through deserts or across seas. Robbery was common, so people turned to paper, not as currency but as representation. These early financial instruments allowed for complex webs of trade to function with safety and speed. They weren't new money, but they were a new kind of trust. In Arabic, the word sack means a written instrument. From it, we get the English word check. These instruments were issued by money changers and bankers, sometimes by wealthy trading houses, and sometimes by partnerships whose reputations were stronger than any seal. To honor a sack was to honor a name. To doubt one was to question more than a sum. It was to question a relationship. In cities like Damascus, Isfahan, and Cordoba, these instruments moved quietly through the hands of scholars, traders, and caravan leaders. They were not flashy. They had no image of kings or saints. Instead, they held words, formal, precise, written in elegant script. They named the sender, the recipient, the value promised, and the conditions of repayment. Some even included blessings or legal language drawn from Islamic finance principles. Interest as a concept was forbidden. But profit through shared risk, that was encouraged. These papers made such arrangements possible, and they made the flow of commerce both moral and mobile. One of the great strengths of the Islamic financial world was its deep respect for record-keeping. Contracts were written in front of witnesses. Scribes were trained to write them clearly and honestly. Courts upheld them with serious care. In a time before insurance or centralized banking, this legal culture gave paper its weight. A merchant might never meet the person who wrote the sack he held, but he would trust the paper if it bore the right marks and names. This culture of paper-based exchange didn't emerge in isolation. It grew out of older traditions, from the receipts of Mesopotamia to the Buddhist notes of China, but it refined them with precision and scale. The Abbasid Caliphate, centered in Baghdad, developed one of the most sophisticated trade systems of the medieval world. It linked oceans and deserts, languages and currencies. And yet, through all this movement, a quiet order held things together, belief in the written word. Even travelers who spoke no Arabic could use these instruments. Persian, Berber, and even Latin traders often engaged with Islamic banking networks. The language of trade was flexible. The grammar of trust was shared. A man arriving in a foreign port with a sack in hand could buy goods, hire ships, pay workers, all without carrying a single coin. This made trade less risky, but also more human, because behind every paper was not just a sum, but a story. Of where it came from, who had signed it, and whether they could be trusted. In this way, paper became not just a tool of trade, but a mirror of reputation. Islamic finance in this period didn't invent the idea of paper promises, but it gave them discipline, elegance, and reach. It treated the paper not just as a placeholder for metal, but as a vehicle for moral conduct. Contracts were expected to reflect fairness. Risk was meant to be shared. Paper in this system wasn't just a shortcut, it was a responsibility. And it allowed commerce to move at the speed of trust. One of the most powerful effects of this system was its invisibility. while coins clinked and ships sailed, the real infrastructure of the economy. The letters, notes, and promises moved in silence. No empire could tax what it couldn't see. No ruler could control what passed from hand to hand in a private office or home. This made the Islamic financial world resilient. Even during times of political instability, the trade routes endured, held together by relationships and records. Europe would learn from this. As crusaders returned and as Mediterranean trade deepened, European merchants began borrowing the structure of the sack. Italian city-states like Venice and Florence developed their own versions. Letters of credit, bank drafts, and promissory notes, all with roots in Islamic finance, began to take hold. Paper had crossed borders again, not just as an idea, but as a practical tool. But in the Islamic world, paper never sought to replace metal. It worked alongside it. Gold and silver still mattered. Coins still changed hands. But more often than not, those hands first passed a folded note, a sealed letter, a quiet promise written in ink. And that promise was enough. In the markets of Cairo and the courtyards of Samarkand, money was not only seen, but read. It was carried in script, remembered by name, and protected by faith. It moved through people, not just pockets. This chapter of paper money is not loud. It has no royal decrees, no forced conversions, no grand announcements. But it shaped the soul of trade. It showed that money could be honest without being hard, flexible without being fragile. It proved that belief, when rooted in shared practice and law, could be more reliable than gold. And as the world changed, as Europe rose and Asia shifted, that belief would travel again. Not through temples or empires this time, but through bankers, explorers, and the quiet spread of paper across the world's hands. Chapter 5: Marco Polo's Shock and the West's Delay. The year was 1275. After 3 years of dust, deserts, mountains, and sea, a young Venetian named Marco Polo arrived at the court of Kublai Khan in China. He had come with his father and uncle, part of a family journey that would last decades. The sights of the East dazzled him. Cities larger than anything in Europe, technologies unknown back home, palaces filled with porcelain, silk, and wealth. But there was one thing that surprised him more than anything else. They used paper as money. Not just as a letter of credit, not just as a merchant's note, real paper, printed, stamped, official, and everyone used it. He wrote about it in wonder. In the Travels of Marco Polo, he described bark paper notes issued by the great Khan, backed by his seal, enforced by law, and accepted everywhere. People used them to buy goods, pay taxes, settle debts. The system was so complete that even gold and silver were rarely seen. Marco called it one of the greatest marvels of the East. He wasn't wrong. To Europeans, the idea was nearly unbelievable. Money had weight. That was its definition. A gold coin gleamed. A silver piece rang with certainty. To hand someone paper, thin, terrible, flammable, and claim it held the same value, it sounded like magic, or worse, fraud. But in China, this wasn't magic. It was administration. The Mongols had scaled up a system China had been developing for centuries. Paper notes printed with mulberry bark, stamped with official seals, declared in careful script, "This note is backed by the state." It was legal tender, enforceable and exchangeable. Anyone refusing to accept it could be punished. anyone forging it could be executed. Trust didn't just float in the air. It was backed by the law. To Polo, this was an empire that had found a lighter way to move wealth. Goods moved quickly. Merchants traveled safely. The emperor could pay armies without shipping coin. Roads and markets ran on belief in the paper and in the hand that issued it. And while Europeans still dealt in heavy purses and guarded caravans, the East had already stepped into a world where value could be printed. And yet, when Polo returned home years later and shared these wonders, Europe didn't listen. Not really. His tales were copied and read, sometimes with awe, sometimes with skepticism. But paper money, that part was often dismissed. It was too strange, too fragile, too foreign. People found it easier to believe in dragons than in a world where paper replaced metal. Europe wasn't ready. Part of the reason was practical. The institutions that gave China's notes their strength. A centralized government, an established printing system, a legal code with nationwide reach, didn't yet exist in Europe. The continent was still divided into kingdoms, city-states, duchies. Each minted its own coins, enforced its own rules, guarded its own vaults. There was no single body trusted by all. But the resistance was also emotional. To many Europeans, money wasn't just a tool, it was a symbol of divine order. Gold and silver were seen as natural, even holy. Their shine was eternal, their weight reassuring. Coins were stamped with kings and saints, to suggest that paper, man-made, temporary, common, could replace this sacred metal felt wrong. And yet paper crept in anyway, quietly, slowly, not as state-issued currency, but as letters of credit, bills of exchange and promissory notes, tools borrowed from Islamic traders and refined by Italian merchants. In the great trading cities of Venice, Genoa, and Florence, merchants began to write value instead of carry it. Still, this wasn't the same as what Polo had seen. These notes weren't legal tender. They weren't universal. They were contracts, not currency. If you held a bill of exchange, you could demand payment from a specific person at a specific place, assuming you trusted them. There was no central issuer, just networks of private trust. That was the real gap between East and West, not paper itself, but the idea of authority. In China, the emperor's word was enough. A single stamp turned bark into money. In Europe, no one voice carried that kind of weight. Trust had to be built transaction by transaction, note by note. And so, while China's paper flowed across empires, Europe's paper inched forward, lettered, private, cautious. Marco Polo had seen a future that Europe couldn't yet imagine, but the seed had been planted. And slowly, across generations, the continent began to shift. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Italian bankers were operating across borders. Their handwritten notes were accepted in faraway cities. Credit moved faster than coin. Names like Medici became powerful not through thrones, but through ledgers. The old belief that only gold was money began to soften. Even so, centuries would pass before European governments printed paper for the public. The trust needed for that leap didn't exist yet. The memory of forgery, war, and economic collapse lingered too close. When paper finally came, it would come in response to need, to crisis, to conflict, to opportunity. But Marco Polo had already seen it. He had walked in cities where coins were rare and paper ran the world. He had held in his hand a note that weighed almost nothing, and yet could buy anything. His shock was not just personal, it was historical. Because money isn't just about what a society uses, it's about what a society believes. And in the 13th century, China believed in the power of paper. Europe didn't, not yet. But one day it would. And when that belief finally arrived, it would not come gently. It would come through war, through goldsmiths, through royal debts and merchant risk, and it would slowly rewrite the meaning of money again. Chapter 6: Europe's First Steps into Paper. In the damp alleys of 17th century London, behind heavy wooden doors and barred windows, goldsmiths quietly began to change the way Europe thought about money. At first, they were just craftsmen, men who shaped precious metals into jewelry, coins, and religious ornaments. But their work required vaults, and those vaults became useful for something else: storage. Merchants and nobles, worried about theft or fire, began leaving their gold with these trusted artisans. In return, the goldsmiths issued paper receipts. The receipts were simple at first, a record of what was stored and by whom, but over time something subtle happened. People began to trade the receipts themselves instead of retrieving the gold. The paper, once just a receipt, became a stand-in for the metal, and without meaning to, the goldsmiths had created a new kind of money. This shift didn't come from royal decree. It came from daily life, from the need for safety, for speed, for something lighter than coin. The paper wasn't backed by law. It was backed by reputation. But as long as people believed the goldsmiths had the metal, the notes moved freely. Soon the goldsmiths noticed something else. Most people didn't come back for their gold. They just traded the notes. So the gold stayed in the vault, untouched. That gave the goldsmiths an idea. If the gold wasn't moving, perhaps they could lend it, or lend notes against it. And so, quietly, they began issuing more receipts than there was gold. The birth of fractional banking had begun. It was a delicate game. As long as only a few people demanded their gold at once, the system held. But if too many came knocking, the illusion would break. Trust was everything. If it cracked, the paper would collapse. This was the root of Europe's uneasy relationship with paper money. It was useful, but it was also dangerous. Governments and merchants saw the potential, but also the risk. Forgery was common. Panics were real. Wars disrupted supply. The memory of lost fortunes lingered in every new experiment. Still, the benefits were too large to ignore. In Amsterdam, Stockholm, and London, banks began to emerge that issued standardized notes. These weren't just receipts. They were designed to be passed from hand to hand, printed with care, signed by trusted officials. In 1661, Sweden's Stockholm's Banco became the first European bank to issue official banknotes. It was a bold move, and a fragile one. Within a few years, the bank had issued too many notes, lost the public's trust, and collapsed. But the idea had proven itself. Paper could be money, if managed carefully. In England, the evolution moved more slowly, shaped by crisis. During the English Civil War, the crown needed money. Gold was scarce. Paper was convenient. In 1694, the Bank of England was established with a single purpose: to lend the government $1.2 million. In exchange, it received the right to issue notes. These notes were not promises from a goldsmith, but from the state. And they were backed not just by gold, but by taxes, by law, by the growing machinery of government. The Bank of England's notes were cautious at first, handwritten, payable to a named individual, but their meaning was revolutionary. For the first time in English history, the public held paper issued by a centralized authority, not a craftsman, not a merchant, but the state itself. And over time, these notes became more than receipts. They became money in their own right. Europe had taken its first firm step into a paper economy. But belief was still fragile. In times of peace, the notes worked. In times of fear, people ran back to gold. Bank runs, panics, and inflation would haunt every paper experiment. Yet the pattern kept repeating. Crisis gave birth to paper. Paper proved useful. Paper became normal. Then it was pushed too far, and the cycle began again. The slow adoption of paper money in Europe wasn't a failure of technology. It was a test of trust. Paper required a new way of thinking, about value, about promises, about what money really was. It had to shed the old belief that worth must be felt in the hand, seen in the shine of metal. It had to teach people that value could be printed, promised, and believed in. This chapter in Europe's history is not marked by one moment but by many small shifts. A goldsmith's receipt passed from hand to hand, a banknote signed in careful ink, a war that made coins scarce and forced trust into paper. Each step was slow, each mistake costly, but the direction was clear. Europe was learning to believe in something it could no longer touch. And as that belief deepened, a new kind of power began to grow, not in vaults or mines, but in paper itself, in the words it carried, in the trust it held. In the next chapter, that power would face its first true test, not in quiet transactions, but in moments of panic, when trust slipped and the paper burned. Chapter 7: The Bank of England and the State's Word. In the heart of London, behind thick stone walls and high iron gates, a quiet transformation began. The year was 1694. England was in the middle of a costly war with France. The treasury was empty. Gold was scarce. Confidence in the future was thin. And out of this need, a new institution was born, the Bank of England. It didn't look like the kind of revolution that would shape the next 3 centuries. There were no crowds, no speeches, no grand vision, just a loan. A group of wealthy merchants and financiers offered the government $1.2 million, a staggering sum at the time. In return, they were granted the right to form a bank. More importantly, they were allowed to issue notes. These notes were promises, not from a goldsmith, but from the state. At first, the banknotes were plain, handwritten, awkward, and used mostly between merchants. But they carried something new, the authority of the government. They weren't backed by private vaults. They were backed by taxes, by military strength, by the word of the crown. This made them different, and slowly it made them powerful. The Bank of England was created to solve a crisis, but it ended up changing the meaning of money. Before this moment, paper in Europe had been personal, a contract between 2 people or 2 firms. Now it was public. It didn't just represent a sum. It represented trust in a system. A note from the Bank of England was not just a claim on gold. It was a message. The state stands behind this. That message took time to settle. For decades, people still preferred coins. They still feared collapse. But the notes circulated, especially among merchants who valued the ease of moving money without moving metal. Over time, the bank printed more notes, standardizing them, making them cleaner, more secure, more widely accepted. By the early 18th century, these paper promises were becoming a regular part of life. The bank began printing fixed denominations, 5, 10, 20, no longer just filling in amounts by hand. The notes included detailed engravings, signatures, and official stamps. Slowly, the public began to trust them, and with that trust, paper began to rise. It wasn't just about convenience, it was about control. By issuing notes, the Bank of England gained the power to influence the entire economy. It could expand credit, contract it, respond to crises. The state, through the bank, now had a lever to move markets, shape trade, fund wars, and guide growth. Money was no longer just a store of value. It was a tool of policy. And yet, beneath all this power, the same rule held. It only worked if people believed. In the early years, that belief was tested often. Wars drained resources. Rumors sparked panic. When too many people demanded gold at once, the bank had to pause payments. These moments reminded everyone that paper was still a promise, not a guarantee. But each time the system recovered. Each time the notes came back. One reason they endured was design. The notes were made with care. Intricate patterns, careful typography, watermarks, all meant to prevent forgery and protect trust. Holding a Bank of England note felt different. It felt official, serious. It looked like something worth believing in. Another reason was consistency. The bank didn't change its notes with each new monarch. It didn't flood the market with reckless printing. It managed its supply with caution. This gave people a reason to believe that the paper would hold its value, not just today, but tomorrow. And over time, belief hardened into habit. By the 1800s, banknotes were part of daily life in Britain. Shops accepted them. Debts were settled with them. Wages were paid with them. And though people still kept an eye on gold, the need to touch metal was fading. This quiet shift had massive consequences. For centuries, power had lived in vaults, in piles of coins, in chests of silver. Now power was moving to printers and policies. The government, through its central bank, could create liquidity, fund wars, support trade, and even influence empire, all with printed promises. It was still fragile, always fragile. If belief slipped, the system could wobble, but belief was becoming routine. The Bank of England had done something subtle and profound. It had taken a temporary solution, paper issued during a crisis, and turned it into a permanent part of the economy, not with force but with repetition, not with speeches but with consistency. And that consistency became contagious. Other countries began to follow. Central banks appeared across Europe. State-backed paper money spread. Some systems collapsed. Some endured. But the direction was clear. The future of money was no longer just metal. It was meaning. At the heart of this change was one idea. A promise made by a powerful institution could carry value. Not because it was rare or beautiful or hard to make, but because people agreed it did. The Bank of England didn't invent paper money, but it proved that paper, when backed by the machinery of the state, could carry the weight of gold. And in the next chapter of this story, that paper would face its most dangerous test, not in peacetime, but in panic. When belief faltered and trust crumbled, what would be left of the promise? Next came the age of crises. and with it, the true test of paper's soul. Chapter 8: Trust, Panic, and Paper Crises. It always starts quietly, a whisper in the market, a rumor in the tavern, a question behind closed doors: is the paper still good? At first, no one wants to say it aloud, but once the doubt begins, it moves fast, faster than the paper it targets. In a system built on belief, fear spreads like fire. By the early 18th century, paper money had gained ground across parts of Europe. The Bank of England was issuing notes. Merchants trusted letters of credit, but not everyone was ready, and not every experiment went well. In 1716, France tried to leap forward. The country was deep in debt after years of war. Its coin supply was thin. The regent of France turned to a Scottish economist named John Law. Law believed paper money could revive the economy. If people trusted paper, they would spend more. If they spent more, business would grow. Jobs would return. Prosperity would rise. The idea sounded logical, and for a while it worked. Law created a central bank, backed by the French crown. It issued paper money, which people could use instead of coin. He also tied the currency to a trading company, the Mississippi Company, promising that profits from trade in the Americas would support the notes. People rushed to buy shares, prices soared, confidence bloomed. But the paper was not backed by enough real wealth. The land in America hadn't produced the returns Law promised. The gold and silver weren't there. The notes kept coming anyway. The market became feverish. Then came the fear. Whispers turned into shouts. People rushed to trade their notes for coin. The bank couldn't deliver. The paper collapsed. The Mississippi Bubble, as it came to be known, left thousands ruined. Law fled the country. The French public, once eager to embrace paper money, turned bitter. For over a century, the idea of state-backed paper would remain tainted in France. This was the danger of belief. When trust is rising, paper seems like a miracle. When trust falls, it feels like a trick. Other countries watched and learned, some more carefully than others. In England, even with the strength of the Bank of England, fear still lived close to the surface. In 1797, during a crisis of confidence linked to war with France, a run on the bank began. People lined up to demand gold for their notes. The gold supply wasn't enough. Parliament passed the Bank Restriction Act, suspending the convertibility of notes into gold. The bank could no longer promise coin on demand. It was a paper economy, not by design but by necessity. Some panicked, but many adapted. Over the next 2 decades, Britain operated with unbacked paper, and surprisingly the system held. Trade continued. Wages were paid. The value of the paper fluctuated, but it didn't vanish. People grumbled, but they adjusted. And when convertibility returned in 1821, the lesson was clear. Paper money could survive, even without gold, if trust in the institution remained. Not all crises were so controlled. In the young United States, panic became a rhythm. In the early 19th century, dozens of private banks issued their own notes. Each note was only as strong as the bank behind it. There was no central currency, no universal standard. A note from one town might be worthless in another. Confidence was local, and when a bank failed, as many did, its paper turned to ash. The Panic of 1837 was one of the most devastating. A mix of land speculation, loose banking, and political missteps led to a collapse. banks failed by the hundreds. Paper money became suspect. Barter returned in some places. The memory lingered. Still, the paper kept coming, because it had to. As economies grew and coin remained limited, paper was the only way to keep trade flowing. But every time trust slipped, every time a bank folded or a note defaulted, people were reminded of the cost. The paper in their pockets could disappear overnight. And yet, again and again, societies came back to it, not because they loved it, but because the alternative, slow, heavy, limited coin, could not meet the needs of modern life. Every crisis made one thing clearer: paper money wasn't just about printing, it was about management, discipline, transparency. A note was only as strong as the system behind it, the policies, the reserves, the honesty. Slowly, central banks learned this. They studied past failures. They tightened controls. They limited overissuance. They built safeguards. Institutions like the Bank of England, and later others like the Federal Reserve, emerged to provide not just paper but structure. But structure was never a guarantee. Even in the 20th century, paper faced shocks. In the Weimar Republic of Germany after World War I, inflation turned into a nightmare. To pay war debts, the government printed notes, more and more. Soon, wages doubled weekly, then daily. Children played with stacks of useless marks. People burned notes for warmth. A loaf of bread cost billions. It was one of the clearest lessons in history. Paper without trust, paper without control, leads to collapse. But even there, paper returned. A new note was issued, backed by land, later by gold. Order was restored, belief rebuilt, and again the people adapted. The same story repeated elsewhere. In Latin America, in Eastern Europe, in parts of Africa and Asia. Crisis, collapse, recovery, belief shaken, then slowly restored. Through it all, one truth remained: paper money is a mirror. It reflects the strength of the system that issues it. When people believe in that system, its honesty, its discipline, its future, the paper holds. When they don't, no design, no signature, no promise can save it. Trust is not a permanent condition. It must be earned, managed, and guarded. And so every piece of paper money carries more than a value. It carries a question. Do you believe this will still be good tomorrow? If the answer is yes, it functions. If not, it fails. Crises, for all their destruction, served a purpose. They reminded governments that belief is not automatic. They reminded people that value is not just printed, it is maintained. The next chapters in this story would take that lesson to heart. As nations rose, and paper became a tool not just of trade but of identity, belief would be rebuilt, not by avoiding risk but by managing it with care. Because paper is fragile, but belief, when protected, can be stronger than gold. Chapter 9: The Dollar, the Revolution, and Faith in a Nation. In a cramped room in Philadelphia, the smell of ink and sweat hung in the air. The year was 1775. Outside, the colonies buzzed with unrest. The first shots of the American Revolution had been fired. Inside, a group of delegates from 13 colonies sat around worn wooden tables, preparing for a war they weren't sure they could win. They needed muskets, uniforms, food, and ships. But most of all, they needed money. Gold was scarce. Foreign loans were uncertain. So they turned to something lighter, something untested. They printed paper. These were the Continentals, the first large-scale paper currency issued by the fledgling United States. They weren't backed by gold or silver. They were backed by the belief in a cause, that these notes, issued by a Congress with no army and no power to tax, would be accepted because they represented the birth of a new nation. The words printed on them weren't just about value. They were about identity. Each note said, in effect, "This is ours." At first the people believed. Patriots accepted Continentals as a gesture of unity. Merchants took them out of loyalty. Soldiers were paid in them. For a brief moment, paper money was a symbol of shared purpose. But belief, however powerful, does not protect against excess. With no steady revenue, Congress printed more notes, then more, and more still. Prices rose. Confidence fell. The notes began to lose their grip on reality. By the end of the war, Continentals were nearly worthless. The phrase, "not worth a Continental," became a bitter joke. It was a harsh lesson. Paper backed only by hope can burn fast. But even in failure, something deeper had taken root. Americans had begun to understand money not just as a thing, but as a story. A reflection of trust, purpose, and shared future. The idea didn't die, it waited. After independence, the United States faced a choice. Should it return to metal, to local currencies, or should it try again to create a national paper backed by something firmer than faith alone? The debates ran deep. Distrust of central authority was strong. The memory of inflation fresh, but the need for unity, across states, currencies, and economies, was stronger. In 1792, the Coinage Act established the U.S. dollar. It was based on silver and gold, borrowing its name from the thaler, a silver coin used across Europe. But even with a metal standard, the hunger for paper remained. Banks across the states issued their own notes. These were backed by deposits but regulated unevenly. In the North, a note might be sound. In the South, it might not be worth the ink. Counterfeiting was rampant. Confusion was normal. There was no single currency, only a patchwork of promises. Then came the Civil War, another rupture, another need for money. In 1861, the Union faced a crisis similar to that of the Revolution. Wars are expensive. Gold reserves were thin. Tax systems couldn't keep up. So again, the government turned to paper. This time it did something bold. It issued greenbacks, national notes not backed by gold but by law. These notes would be legal tender for all debts, public and private. People were required to accept them. Their value wasn't in metal, but in mandate. The response was mixed. Some cheered, some feared. Inflation followed. But this time the system held. The government survived. The war was won. And by the 1870s, the U.S. returned to a gold-backed system. But the greenback had left its mark. It had shown that the state could issue paper money that lived. If not without pain, then with possibility. And all the while the dollar was growing, not just as currency but as a symbol. It began to stand for more than price. It stood for American strength, productivity, and ambition. The notes carried images of presidents, eagles, and government buildings, not just decoration but messaging. Holding a dollar felt like holding a piece of the nation itself. This was more than branding, it was belief building. The government learned that the look of a note mattered, its consistency mattered, its protection against counterfeiting mattered. Each change to the dollar, from color to watermark to signature, was an effort to maintain a fragile truth. This paper has value because we agree it does. By the early 20th century, the U.S. had created a more centralized system. In 1913, the Federal Reserve was established. It would oversee the money supply, respond to banking panics, and issue standardized notes, Federal Reserve notes. These would become the modern U.S. dollar. They were backed by the assets of the central bank, not directly by gold, and slowly they became the dominant currency in daily life. The transformation was gradual but deep. The dollar became the common thread across states, cities, and classes. Whether earned by farmers in Iowa or factory workers in Detroit, it represented the same thing. Purchasing power, yes, but also a shared story, a unity of trust. It also became an export. As the U.S. economy grew, so did demand for the dollar abroad. Foreign governments held it in reserves. Traders used it to price oil, wheat, and steel. The dollar began to serve as a global reference point, and its strength rested not on gold but on the belief that America, with its laws, its institutions, and its economy, would honor its debts. This was the quiet genius of paper money in America. It evolved not just through innovation, but through challenge. Each war, each panic, each collapse forced a reckoning, and each time belief was shaken but not shattered. The dollar bent, it stumbled, but it did not break. Because at its core, it was more than money. It was an idea. That a nation built on rebellion and uncertainty could create something stable. That trust could be re-earned. That paper, handled with care, could carry weight greater than metal. The road to the modern dollar was not straight. It was full of mistakes, inflation, fear, and political fights. But through it all, Americans kept coming back to one quiet truth: money works only when we believe in it together. And as the U.S. stepped further into the modern age, that belief would be tested again, in global markets, in gold crises, in decisions that would untie the paper from metal forever. Because even the strongest stories, if told too loosely, can lose their shape. And soon the world would have to choose between the comfort of gold and the flexibility of pure paper, between the memory of weight and the reality of trust. Chapter 10: The Gold Standard and the Golden Illusion. For centuries, gold sat at the center of money's meaning. Its color, its weight, its permanence. These were more than physical traits. They were emotional anchors. In every coin struck and vault sealed, gold whispered a quiet promise: I am real. I do not change. You can trust me. By the 19th century, that promise had been formalized. Nations across Europe, and eventually the United States, adopted what became known as the gold standard. It was simple in theory. Every paper note could be exchanged for a fixed amount of gold. Every currency had a direct tie to something solid. Invisible trust was now secured by something visible, something that gleamed in the light and resisted the passage of time. The idea wasn't new. For centuries, gold had served as a universal measure of value, but the gold standard made it official, mechanical. A pound sterling was worth a set number of grains of gold. A U.S. dollar was pegged to a specific weight. Central banks had to hold enough gold to back their circulating notes. In return, citizens believed the paper they held could, at any moment, be redeemed for something precious. And for a while, it worked. Trade grew, currencies stabilized, exchange rates became predictable. Investors moved capital across borders with confidence, knowing that money had a fixed meaning. A French businessman could accept a British note without fear, knowing that gold backed it. A German banker could trust a dollar because it, too, was tied to the same metal. It felt orderly, rational, secure. But beneath the surface, something fragile was building. Gold had limits. It could not be printed. It had to be mined, moved, guarded. Economies, on the other hand, wanted to grow. Populations expanded. Trade increased. Industry demanded credit. And every time a central bank wanted to issue more money, it had to check its vaults. Do we have enough gold? This tether created tension. In times of stability, the system seemed elegant, but when crises hit, wars, recessions, banking collapses, the gold standard became a chain. Governments couldn't move quickly. They couldn't stimulate economies or rescue failing banks without risking their gold reserves. Flexibility vanished. Worse, trust in paper sometimes became too literal. When fear spread, people rushed to convert their notes into gold. Banks were drained. Reserves vanished. Paper lost its power not because the system failed, but because people stopped believing in it just long enough to break it. The illusion of gold's permanence became a trap. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, the gold standard turned a financial crisis into a global catastrophe. Nations couldn't respond quickly enough. They raised interest rates to protect gold reserves, deepening unemployment. They slashed spending to keep their currencies stable, prolonging the pain. The system that had once promised security now delivered suffering. One by one, countries began to drop the gold standard. Britain left it in 1931. The United States followed in 1933, when President Franklin D. Roosevelt halted gold redemptions and revalued the dollar. Paper was no longer a direct claim on gold. It became something else, a managed promise, a floating belief. For many, this felt like betrayal. The psychological comfort of gold had run deep. It was not just a metal, it was a myth, a story of order and value passed down through generations. To let it go felt dangerous, reckless, unmoored. But something strange happened. As countries left gold behind, their economies began to recover. Freed from the metal's grip, governments could lower interest rates, spend on jobs, support banks. Paper regained power not by being tied to gold, but by being backed by action. Confidence returned, not in metal, but in policy. This shift revealed a deeper truth. Gold had never been the real source of trust. It had been a symbol, a reassurance. But what people needed was not the ability to hold gold in their hand. They needed to believe that their money would still matter tomorrow, that it would still buy bread, pay rent, hold meaning. And belief, it turned out, could rest on more than metal. That didn't mean gold vanished. It still held allure. Central banks continued to store it. Investors treated it as a hedge against uncertainty. Nations measured their strength in part by their gold reserves, but paper had begun to stand on its own. The link was fading. Even after World War II, when the Bretton Woods system attempted to restore a gold-based order, the connection was partial. The US dollar became the global anchor, and it was tied to gold. But other currencies were tied to the dollar. Most people never touched gold again. They used notes and later checks and eventually numbers on a screen. Gold sat in vaults, quiet and unused while money flowed without it. The illusion had been reversed. Gold still gleamed, but it no longer ruled. What had once been seen as the foundation of value now sat to the side, ceremonial and symbolic. The real power had moved into the hands of central banks, into fiscal policy, into collective belief. This wasn't the death of gold, but it was the end of its supremacy. In the public mind, gold would always carry weight. It would always feel like real money, but its role had changed. It was no longer the guarantee behind paper. It was a reminder of a time when value had to be held to be trusted. Now trust moved differently. It was built through systems, laws, reputations, and results. It could be damaged by bad policy and rebuilt by good leadership. Paper had become more than a proxy. It had become a reflection of confidence, competence, and cohesion. The gold standard had offered stability, but it came at a cost. In the end, the world chose flexibility. It chose the living uncertainty of managed currencies over the cold comfort of fixed metal. And with that choice, the story of money took another quiet turn. It moved further away from the physical, deeper into the conceptual. Paper remained, but the metal behind it had faded. And soon, even the paper would begin to vanish. A new era was coming, one where value would live in numbers alone, in quiet servers and glowing screens, where money would no longer need to be printed at all. Chapter 11: Paper Goes to War. In times of peace, money flows quietly, through banks, markets, shops, and homes, but in times of war, money changes. It becomes louder, faster, more aggressive. It becomes a weapon, a promise stretched thin, a tool for survival. During the great wars of the 20th century, paper money stopped being just a means of exchange. It became a matter of national urgency, of propaganda, of control. World War I cracked the world's financial systems. When the fighting began in 1914, most of the major powers were still on the gold standard. Paper money could still be redeemed for precious metal. That tie was supposed to keep governments disciplined, honest, but war is expensive, more expensive than anything else a state can do. As troops were mobilized and factories turned toward arms production, the need for money exploded. Quickly, the gold standard became impossible to maintain. Countries suspended convertibility. Gold disappeared from circulation. Paper remained, not as a placeholder for metal, but as the main currency. Governments printed to fund their armies. In Britain, Germany, Russia, France, and elsewhere, notes filled the gap that gold left behind. For a time, it worked. Soldiers were paid, supplies were bought, the war machine moved. But the longer the war lasted, the harder it became to hold on to trust. In Germany and Austria-Hungary, where the war dragged on and defeat became likely, inflation soared. Governments printed more and more, trying to keep the economy moving. The notes still looked the same, decorated with national symbols, carefully stamped, but behind them the value was hollowing out. After the war, the situation worsened. In Weimar Germany, from 1921 to 1923, paper money collapsed completely. What had once been worth a meal now barely bought a matchstick. Families carried notes in baskets. Children played with bricks of bills. People used them as wallpaper or kindling. At its peak, inflation reached absurd levels. Billions of marks for a loaf of bread. all the state's promises printed on paper had lost their meaning. It was a profound lesson. Paper alone could not carry value, not without limits, not without structure. Trust, once broken, could not be restored by printing more promises. The people who lived through that collapse never forgot it, and the fear of repeating it would shape monetary policy for generations. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the United States emerged from World War I stronger. Its dollar, backed by a growing industrial economy, became a symbol of post-war confidence. American paper held its value, and during the Great Depression, when other nations still clung to gold, the U.S. broke free. In 1933, President Roosevelt ended the gold standard for domestic use. Gold could no longer be traded freely. Paper became the core of the system. Not a claim on metal, but a claim on the state. Then came World War II's. The financial stakes were even greater. Nations didn't just fight with bullets and bombs, they fought with money, lots of it. In the U.S., war bonds were sold to fund the effort. Citizens lent their savings to the government, receiving paper certificates in return. Posters urged people to buy bonds not just as an investment but as a duty. The slogan was everywhere, "Buy bonds, back the attack." Paper became emotional. It wasn't just about economics, it was about morale. Propaganda flooded the public with images of paper promises, a mother holding a bond while her son marched off to war, a worker in a factory, buying bonds with every paycheck. Each note, each certificate, was a thread in the national fabric. In Nazi Germany, the printing press ran hot. The regime funded its early recovery with deficit spending, masked by tight controls and creative accounting. During the war, it created occupation currencies for the lands it conquered, special paper money issued by the Reich, replacing local currencies and asserting economic control. These notes weren't backed by anything but power. Once the regime fell, they became worthless overnight. The Japanese did the same in parts of Asia, flooding occupied countries with invasion money. In the Philippines, people were forced to accept Japanese-issued pesos. As the war turned against Japan, those notes rapidly lost value. After liberation, people burned them in celebration, paper as both symbol and ash. For civilians caught in the middle, paper money became a survival tool. In war zones, currency changed often. One day a local note, the next an occupying forces version. People hoarded whatever seemed stable. Dollars, pounds, francs, or turned to barter. In some places, cigarettes became currency. In others, canned goods or cloth. When paper was no longer trusted, anything useful took its place. But even in the chaos, something held. The idea of money didn't vanish. People still looked for something to trade, to hold onto, to trust. Even after currencies collapsed, new ones were printed, new promises made, new faith built slowly. After the war, the world faced a choice. Return to gold, rebuild paper. The answer came in a quiet room in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944. A new system, pegged to the US dollar, itself tied to gold. But that chapter would come next. For now, paper had proven its endurance. It had carried economies through catastrophe. It had funded victory and loss. It had been used, abused, inflated, burned, and yet, still it returned. Because in war, money reveals what it always was. Not metal, not paper, but belief. a belief that must be earned, protected, and, in times of crisis, fiercely defended. And as the smoke cleared, nations prepared for peace. A new world was forming, and with it, a new order of money. One still printed, still fragile, still powerful, and now more global than ever. Chapter 12: Bretton Woods and the Paper World Order. In the summer of 1944, as World War II still raged across continents, a different kind of battle was being waged in a quiet New Hampshire resort town called Bretton Woods. Representatives from 44 Allied nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel. Economists, bankers, and politicians. Not to fight, but to plan what would come after the war. They knew that victory was close. What they didn't know was how to rebuild the global economy once the guns fell silent. The world before the war had been fractured by mistrust. The gold standard had failed. Currencies had collapsed. Great powers had turned inward. Trade had dried up. And when the war finally ends, they feared chaos could return. To prevent this, the nations at Bretton Woods set out to design something bold, a new international system, one that would stabilize currencies, encourage trade, and rebuild trust across borders. At the center of this plan was a simple idea. If the world could agree on how money worked, how it moved, how it was valued, how it was exchanged, then the scars of war could begin to heal. Money, in this vision, would not just fund economies, it would hold peace together. The structure they built came to be known as the Bretton Woods system. Its foundations rested on paper, but not just national paper, international paper. And at the heart of it all sat the US dollar. Under the new agreement, each country would peg its currency to the dollar, and the dollar in turn would be tied to gold at a fixed rate, $35 for 1 ounce. This gave the world a single reference point. If you held dollars, you could, in theory, exchange them for gold. Other currencies, meanwhile, would stabilize in relation to the dollar. In this way, the dollar became a bridge, not just between currencies, but between trust and value. Why the dollar? Because by 1944, the United States had become the world's economic giant. Its factories had powered the war. Its gold reserves were the largest on Earth. While Europe and Asia lay in ruins, America stood tall. Its currency, backed by both gold and industrial might, seemed the safest anchor the world could choose. And so the dollar, once a local currency, quietly became global. But Bretton Woods did more than fix exchange rates. It created new institutions. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, would oversee currency stability and provide short-term loans to countries in trouble. The World Bank would finance long-term development and reconstruction. Both institutions were designed not just to manage money, but to manage cooperation. This was something new, a system where paper promises were upheld not just by individual nations, but by shared institutions. It was an attempt to tame the volatility of the past, to prevent another Great Depression, to avoid the kind of monetary collapse that had helped fuel the rise of fascism and global war. And for a while, it worked. The post-war decade saw remarkable growth. Europe rebuilt, Japan industrialized, trade expanded, and all the while dollars flowed, not just within the United States but across oceans and borders. Central banks held them, governments used them, markets trusted them. U.S. paper became the reserve currency of the world. But behind the calm surface, pressure was building. As the U.S. printed more dollars to fund foreign aid, military spending, and domestic programs, questions began to rise. Was there still enough gold to back it all? Foreign governments, especially France, started to worry. They held vast sums of dollars but had no clear view of how much gold stood behind them. If too many tried to redeem their dollars at once, would the system hold? This was the quiet flaw at the center of Bretton Woods. It still depended on gold, but only one country controlled that gold, and only one currency had the privilege of being redeemable for it. The promise that each dollar represented a fixed slice of gold was becoming harder to keep. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, trust in the system began to waver, not publicly, not yet, but in quiet meetings, in diplomatic cables, in the ledgers of central banks. The world was becoming more complex, more interconnected. Capital moved faster. Trade expanded beyond expectations. But the gold standard stayed rigid, a relic trying to survive in a changing world. The irony was clear. A system built to create stability was becoming a source of tension. In the late 1960s, the cracks widened. Inflation rose in the U.S., confidence dipped abroad. More countries started converting their dollars into gold. Fort Knox, once overflowing, began to shrink. And then, in 1971, the breaking point came. President Richard Nixon, facing a gold drain and economic pressure, made a decision that changed the global monetary system forever. He suspended the dollar's convertibility into gold. The move was meant to be temporary. It wasn't. With that single act, announced on television without warning, the last formal link between paper money and gold was severed. The dollar became a fiat currency, backed not by metal but by belief in the United States itself. And since every other currency was tied to the dollar, the entire world shifted in an instant. The Bretton Woods system, though never officially dismantled, had ended. The paper world order it created didn't vanish. It evolved. Currencies began to float. Central banks adapted. The IMF adjusted its role, but the framework of global cooperation it had fostered remained. And so a strange outcome emerged. The dollar, now untied from gold, did not collapse. It strengthened. Its reach expanded. What had begun as a promise backed by metal became a promise backed by reputation, size, and faith in a system that no longer needed gold to hold it together. The world had crossed another invisible threshold. The age of paper had matured, not just national paper but international. Not just money for trade, but money for diplomacy, strategy, and global balance. Central banks no longer worried only about gold reserves. They worried about stability, inflation, growth, and credibility. The nature of trust had changed. And yet one thing remained. At the heart of every note, every transaction, every digital transfer across borders was the same invisible thread: belief. The belief that someone, somewhere, would honor the value of that promise, not with metal but with action. Bretton Woods was not the end of gold. It was the beginning of something more complex. A world where value floats, where trust is managed, where paper is still powerful, even as it becomes harder to see. In the chapters ahead, that paper would drift even further from the physical. The future of money would soon become not something you could hold, but something you could only trust. Chapter 13, Breaking the Anchor, Nixon and 1971. It happened on a quiet Sunday night, August 15, 1971. Most Americans were watching television, maybe eating dinner with their families, unaware that something invisible was about to shift. President Richard Nixon appeared on the screen. His tone was calm. His words were measured. He spoke of speculation, of strength, of protecting the American dollar. Then, almost as a footnote, he announced that the United States would suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold. With that single sentence, the anchor of the global monetary system, the promise that a U.S. dollar could be exchanged for a fixed amount of gold, was lifted, quietly, unilaterally, permanently. The world's money had just lost its last tie to metal. The gold window, as it was called, had been under pressure for years. Since the end of World War II, the Bretton Woods system had held the global economy together. Currencies were pegged to the dollar, and the dollar was pegged to gold. It created stability, predictability, order, but it also created strain. The United States had to act as both the world's central bank and its own. It printed dollars to fund the Cold War, the Vietnam War, and sweeping domestic programs. And as dollars spread across the world, other countries began to doubt whether the U.S. had enough gold to back them. They were right to worry. By the late 1960s, America's gold reserves were shrinking. France, under President Charles de Gaulle, had already begun demanding gold for its dollar holdings. Others followed. A quiet run on U.S. gold began. Confidence slipped. Behind closed doors, world leaders debated solutions. But in the end, Nixon acted alone. Closing the gold window was supposed to be temporary, a pause to restore order. But the deeper truth was this: the world had already outgrown gold. The system had become too complex, too fast, too global to be held in place by a fixed metal standard. The gold in Fort Knox could no longer keep pace with the dollars flowing through international trade, oil markets, foreign aid, and private investment. Gold was a cage. Nixon opened the door. At first, the move triggered confusion. Markets trembled. Currency values swayed. Countries scrambled to adjust their own monetary policies. But the collapse didn't come. The dollar did not fail. Paper money did not unravel. In fact, it kept going, floating, adapting. This was the strange power of belief. The promise had changed, but people kept accepting it, not because they could redeem their paper for gold, but because they believed the paper still mattered. They trusted the system behind it, however imperfect. They believed the United States, with its economy, its influence, its size, would stand behind its money, even without metal. The world entered a new era, the era of fiat currency. Fiat, from the Latin fiat meaning let it be done. Money now was not backed by substance. It was backed by decree. It had value because governments said it did, and because people believed those governments could manage it. This was both liberating and terrifying. Without the gold constraint, central banks had room to breathe. They could respond to crises, stimulate economies, adjust interest rates, expand credit. Monetary policy became a tool, not a trap. But without gold, there was also no hard limit, no built-in brake. The only guardrail was discipline, and discipline could be political, emotional, fallible. The decade that followed tested that discipline. Oil shocks, inflation, and recession gripped much of the developed world. Prices soared, wages lagged. People watched their money lose value and wondered whether paper, untethered, could still be trusted. In the United States, inflation hit double digits. The dollar, once steady, felt unstable. Confidence faltered, but the system did not collapse. Central banks raised rates, tightened supply, fought inflation slowly, painfully, and belief, strained as it was, endured. Other countries adapted too. Some floated their currencies freely. Others pegged them to stronger ones. The International Monetary Fund shifted its role, no longer defending fixed exchange rates but helping countries manage floating ones. The rules had changed, not through design but through necessity. And through it all, the dollar remained central. Even without gold behind it, it held its place as the world's reserve currency. Oil was priced in dollars. International loans were issued in dollars. Countries held dollar reserves as insurance. The U.S., by virtue of history, size, and inertia, kept its role at the core of the global system. This gave America a unique kind of privilege, the ability to print the world's money. It could run trade deficits without the same pressure others faced. It could borrow cheaply, endlessly. But it also carried a responsibility to maintain credibility, stability, and leadership in a world that now depended on its paper. The break from gold in 1971 wasn't just a policy change, it was a philosophical shift. For most of human history, money had been tied to the earth, to metal dug from the ground, minted, and passed from hand to hand. Now it was tied to something else, human judgment. Money became an agreement, a language, a mirror of trust. Nixon didn't frame it that way. He spoke of protecting the American worker, stopping inflation, fighting speculators. But beneath those words was something more profound, the admission that belief mattered more than bullion, that the idea of money had become bigger than gold could contain. And remarkably, the world adapted. Today, people still talk about returning to the gold standard. They speak of safety, of simplicity, but the truth is there's no going back. The global economy no longer fits inside vaults. Its value moves in real time, across borders, screens, and systems. Gold still shines, but it no longer rules. What rules now is belief. In institutions, in stability in each other, and that belief, while fragile, has proven astonishingly resilient. When Nixon closed the gold window, he didn't break money. He revealed what it had always been becoming, a human system built on faith, managed by choice and guided, we hope, by wisdom. And in the chapters that followed, money would drift even further from the visible. The future would belong not just to paper, but to digits, networks, and code. Gold had anchored the past, but the future of money would float, untethered, uncertain, and everywhere. Chapter 14, From Paper to Digital Ghosts. In the quiet hum of a checkout line, a hand hovers over a phone screen. A tap, a beep, payment approved, no coins, no notes, no signature, no wait, money moves, invisible, instant, and gone before it can even be felt. What once passed from palm to palm now moves through wires, satellites, silent networks. Money in this new age is no longer something we hold. It's something we see, if only for a second, as a number on a screen. The transition from paper to digital didn't happen all at once. It began slowly, as most deep changes do. In the late 20th century, credit cards replaced bills for big purchases, then debit cards for small ones. ATMs became normal, payroll became electronic, paper checks thinned out. By the early 2000s, online banking turned balance sheets into browser tabs. People stopped carrying cash. They started carrying passwords. But this wasn't just convenience. It was a shift in the very nature of money, from the tactile to the abstract, from something we could fold and feel to something that lived in circuits and servers, unseen and everywhere. The paper we once tucked into wallets had become data. Governments and banks embraced the change. Digital money was cheaper to manage, harder to counterfeit, easier to track. Transactions could be recorded instantly. Fraud could be flagged. Monetary policy could move with speed. And as commerce moved online, as shops became websites and malls became apps, it only made sense that money would follow. But beneath the surface, something deeper was happening. The experience of money, how we relate to it, how we feel it, was fading. There was no longer a physical limit, no more empty wallets or fat envelopes, just numbers, always numbers. And as money lost its shape, it also lost some of its friction. It became easier to spend, harder to remember. Tap, swipe, scroll, the rituals of cash, counting, handing, receiving, disappeared. In this new landscape, trust had to evolve again, no longer just in banks or governments, but in code, encryption, and interface. We had to believe not just in the value of money, but in the security of the systems that moved it. That belief was tested often. Data breaches, card fraud, phishing scams, glitches that froze accounts or wiped balances. Each time the question rose again, what does it mean to trust something you can't see? For central banks, the shift to digital opened new possibilities. Interest rates could be adjusted with a keystroke. Stimulus payments could be distributed with a click, but it also raised new questions. What happens when money moves faster than regulation? When private tech companies begin to handle payments once managed only by banks? When currencies are no longer national, but global? The rise of digital wallets, mobile payments, and app-based banking gave consumers more control, but also more exposure. Companies like PayPal, Apple, and Google began sitting between people and their money. Then came cryptocurrencies, led by Bitcoin, not controlled by any government, not backed by any central authority, just lines of code, belief in scarcity, and a decentralized ledger called the blockchain. Bitcoin's arrival in 2009 marked another rupture. At first, it seemed like a curiosity, digital tokens mined by hobbyists, but it carried a radical idea: money without intermediaries, money not created by a state but by a protocol. Its value wasn't in gold or in law, but in math and trust. Trust that the code would not change, that the supply was fixed, that the system was fair. It was a reaction to the 2008 financial crisis, when the global banking system had wavered and central banks had printed trillions in response. Bitcoin and the technologies that followed it asked a simple question: if money can be created by code, why should we only trust governments to do it? Soon the floodgates opened. Thousands of cryptocurrencies emerged. Some aimed to be currencies, others platforms, others speculative assets. Exchanges popped up. Fortunes were made and lost. Regulation struggled to keep pace. The idea of money, once defined by weight, then by paper, now by algorithms, had entered a new phase. But even as digital money expanded, the need for belief never vanished. If anything, it became more urgent. People had to trust not just institutions, but entire systems they didn't fully understand. Not just where their money was, but what it was. And yet, people adapted, as they always had. In many countries, digital payments now dominate. In China, platforms like Alipay and WeChat Pay handle billions in transactions. In Scandinavia, cash has nearly disappeared. Even in developing nations, mobile money leapfrogged traditional banking. Farmers in Kenya send payments by phone. Street vendors in India scan QR codes. The age of cash is receding. Central banks are responding in kind. Across the world, countries are exploring, or launching, central bank digital currencies, CBDCs. These are digital forms of national money, backed by the state, stored in apps instead of vaults. The goal is control, efficiency, inclusion, and to ensure that governments don't lose their role in the future of money. But CBDCs also signal a closing loop. With them, every transaction could, in theory, be tracked, every payment monitored. Money, once private and unrecorded, becomes fully transparent. This raises new questions. What happens to privacy, to freedom, to the quiet spaces money once offered? As paper fades and digital grows, money becomes more powerful and more invisible. It flows faster, but also further from sight. It's no longer in our pockets, but in platforms. No longer passed by hand, but by signal. We don't touch it, we tap it. We don't count it, we trust the screen. And yet, the human need behind it hasn't changed. We still trade. We still save. We still hope. We still build futures on the quiet assumption that the number we see today will mean something tomorrow. From shells to coins, from gold to notes, from paper to pixels, money has always changed, but its meaning has always rested on something constant, belief, that the promise still holds, that the system still works. That value, though invisible, is real. Now, as we stand on the edge of a fully digital world, we are no longer asking, what is money made of? We are asking, who do we trust to make it? And in the final chapter of this journey, we return to the core, not to the systems or symbols, but to the belief that brought them to life. Chapter 15, The Quiet Power of Belief. In the beginning, money was a thing, a piece of metal, a grain of salt, a carved stone. It had weight, it had shape, it held its own value. But over time, that began to change. The shape faded, the weight disappeared. What remained and quietly took over was belief. Not belief in the object itself, but in what it represented. That slow shift, from substance to story, is the real history of money. Today we no longer carry our wealth in bags of silver or fold it into thick stacks of paper. More often, we glance at numbers glowing from screens, floating in apps, moving silently between invisible hands. We send salaries in keystrokes. We pay bills without touching a thing. The symbols we rely on have never been lighter or more powerful. And yet, behind every digital payment, every banknote, every coin, every credit line, lies the same fragile truth. It only works because we believe it does. That belief is not abstract. It's human. It is built slowly. By consistency, by protection, by the shared understanding that others will also accept what we accept. It is taught to children who watch their parents exchange green bills for groceries. It is affirmed by every paycheck that clears, every receipt that prints, every tap that goes through, and it is tested, again and again, by crisis, by failure, by greed, and by change. When that belief is strong, money feels invisible. It flows, it works. No one thinks twice, but when it cracks, when a bank fails, when a currency falls, when a promise is broken, the silence of money becomes loud. The entire system trembles. People line up, prices jump, wealth evaporates, not because the paper changed, but because belief did. It is easy to forget that trust is a kind of infrastructure, not made of stone or steel, but of habits, institutions, and shared expectations. In every society, money reflects the state of that infrastructure. A strong system produces stable money. A failing one produces chaos. And in that way, money becomes a mirror, not of markets alone, but of the people and governments who make them. This is why money is never just economic. It is emotional. It holds our fears, our hopes, our memories. It marks the first time we were paid for our work, the savings we built slowly over years, the gift we gave without asking for return. It tells us something about who we are and what we value, not just personally, but together. That togetherness is what makes money possible. A coin by itself is nothing. A piece of paper without context is worthless. Even a digital token, perfectly programmed, is meaningless without someone on the other end who accepts it. What gives money life is the web of agreement that surrounds it, the quiet, daily rituals of use, the social contracts we rarely name but always obey. When governments collapse, so does their money. When banks lie, trust bleeds out. But when a nation rebuilds, when communities come together, when rules are honored and promises kept, money begins to breathe again. Not through printing presses or policy alone, but through the slow, human work of reestablishing belief. That work is never finished, because belief is not static. It evolves with us. As our lives grow more digital, more decentralized, more global, so too does our relationship with money. We are asked to place our trust in algorithms, in cloud servers, in code. We must decide who we believe, not just which banks or governments, but which systems, which symbols, which stories. Some choose the old. Gold coins in vaults, bills under mattresses, hard assets that feel tangible. Others embrace the new. Cryptocurrencies, digital wallets, programmable money with no center. Most live in between, navigating a world where belief is stretched across many forms, held together by a quiet sense that the system still works. But belief doesn't mean blind faith. It demands attention. It asks questions. It requires us to watch how money is made, who makes it, who benefits from it, and who is left out. It asks us to remember that every currency has consequences, that the way we manage money reflects the kind of society we are building, or neglecting to build. Because money is not neutral, it flows toward power. It reinforces systems. It can liberate and it can exclude. It can open doors or close them. It can create opportunity or deepen inequality. The beliefs we build into money, about value, work, risk, worth, shape more than our wallets. They shape our world. This is why understanding the story of money matters, not to chase wealth, not to master markets, but to see clearly what we are part of, to realize that money is not something outside of us. It is a creation, ours, made by generations, revised by necessity, and sustained by faith. From temples and clay tablets to blockchain and mobile payments, The arc of money has always bent toward abstraction, but the beating heart has never changed. It is the quiet agreement between people, to believe in something, to use it, to pass it forward. That agreement is fragile, but it is also resilient. It has survived wars, collapses, revolutions, and reinventions. It has taken new shapes without losing its core. It has followed us from the weight of metal to the promise of paper to the whisper of code. And as we move into the future, a future of artificial intelligence, of programmable currency, of money without borders or form, we would do well to remember this. The real currency has always been belief. Not belief in the money itself, but in each other, in the systems we build, in the values we choose to hold. Because money is not the story of wealth, it is the story of trust. And that, more than anything printed or stored or spent, is what makes it real.